Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, I want to tell you a story. It's not an easy one, but sometimes the darkest stories help us understand the fragility of the world we live in. This is the story of Bruce Pardo and the night that forever changed the quiet suburb of Covina, California. Take a deep breath. This happened on Christmas Eve, 2008, and like so many true crime stories, it began long before that terrible night. Bruce Jeffrey Pardo was born on March 23, 1963, in Los Angeles. By all accounts, he was a bright kid. His father was an engineer, and Bruce seemed destined to follow in those footsteps. He graduated from John A. Francis Polytechnic High School and went on to California State University, Northridge, where he earned a degree in computer science. The people who knew young Bruce remembered him as charismatic, funny, outgoing. At his college graduation, he walked across the stage, carrying an inflatable doll just to make people laugh. He had that kind of personality, sharp-witted, clever, the type of guy who could light up a room. After graduation, he landed what seemed like a dream job at the prestigious Jet Propulsion Laboratory in La Cañada, Flintridge. For a young engineer, that was about as good as it got. But beneath that charming exterior, there were cracks. Small ones at first, the kind you might not notice unless you looked closely. In the 1980s, Bruce got engaged to a woman named Delia. They planned their wedding for June of 1989. Now here's where things get strange. Delia paid for everything, the entire wedding. She drained her savings every last penny to make their special day happen. Bruce contributed nothing. When the wedding day arrived, Delia stood at the altar, alone. Bruce never showed up. No one could reach him. No explanation. Nothing. A few weeks later, he reappeared. Turned out he'd taken Delia's last $3,000 and used it to fund a solo vacation to Palm Beach. Just walked away from the whole thing like it was nothing. That tells you something about Bruce, doesn't it? About how he valued other people, about how easily he could disappear when things got uncomfortable. Years passed. Bruce moved on. In the early 2000s, he met a woman named Elena Lucano, and they began an on-again, off-again relationship. They had a son together, a beautiful little boy who should have had a normal, happy life. But when that boy was just over a year old, something happened. One day, Elena left Bruce at home watching their son, while she went grocery shopping. It should have been a simple errand. 45 minutes, maybe an hour, but when she came home, she found Bruce frantically holding their unconscious toddler. The boy had gotten into the backyard pool. Somehow Bruce hadn't noticed. By the time he found him, the damage was done. They rushed the child to the hospital. He survived, but the oxygen deprivation had caused severe, irreversible brain damage. That little boy would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Unable to care for himself. He was only 13 months old. Elena sued Bruce's homeowner's insurance for $100,000 to cover medical bills and set up a special needs trust. According to Elena's attorney, Bruce lived with overwhelming guilt after that. But here's the thing, after the settlement was reached in August of 2002, Bruce stopped communicating completely. He never saw his son again. Never saw Elena again. Just vanished from their lives. And he never told anyone about what happened. Not even the woman who would become his next wife. In 2004, Bruce met Sylvia Ortega. She was 43 years old, warm, close with her family. Her best friend would later describe her as kind, generous, the type of person who lit up your life. Bruce and Sylvia got married, and for a little while, maybe things seemed okay, but the marriage was troubled from the start. Bruce wanted everything separate, separate bank accounts, separate finances. He didn't want to integrate their lives. Sylvia told her best friend that he just changed after they got married. He was distant, cold. It didn't feel like love. And then Sylvia discovered the truth. Through Bruce's own mother, who had grown increasingly frustrated with her son's behavior, Sylvia learned about the child Bruce had hidden from her. The son with brain damage. And worse, she learned that Bruce had been dodging his child support payments while still claiming the boy as a dependent on his tax returns to get the benefits. He was essentially profiting off a child he'd abandoned. That was it for Sylvia. She couldn't stay with someone capable of that kind of deception. That kind of cruelty toward his own son. In March of 2008, they separated. Sylvia moved back in with her parents, Joseph and Alicia Ortega, in their two-story home on Knollcrest Drive in Covina. The divorce proceedings got ugly. Really ugly. Bruce was ordered to pay $1,785 a month in spousal support. He complained bitterly to the court that Sylvia was living rent-free with her parents while spending money on a luxury car, gambling trips to Las Vegas, expensive restaurants, massages, golf lessons. He resented every penny. Then in July of 2008, Bruce was fired from his job at ITT Corporation. His employer discovered he'd been fraudulently billing clients for hours he hadn't actually worked. Suddenly, Bruce had no income. The court suspended his spousal support payments due to financial hardship. But when the divorce was finalized on December 18th, just 1 week before Christmas, Bruce still had to pay Sylvia $10,000 as part of the settlement. She also got to keep her wedding ring and the family dog. For Bruce, this wasn't just about money. It was about control, about losing, about being exposed as someone who'd failed, who'd been caught lying, who couldn't keep a job or a marriage together. And from what investigators would later piece together, those feelings of rage and humiliation had been building for months. He began planning something terrible. In September of 2008, 3 months before the massacre, Bruce walked into a costume shop less than 2 miles from his home. The owner, a seamstress named Jerry Diata, remembered him clearly. He ordered a custom-made Santa Claus suit, but not just any suit. He wanted it extra large. Huge. Bigger than he was. Jerry would later tell reporters. That's what triggered it to me, because I heard on the news that he carried some guns inside. Bruce told her he needed it for a holiday party in early November. He wanted to look extra jolly. He said, the suit cost $300. Jerry made it to his specifications and never thought about it again, until she saw the news that Christmas. What she didn't know was that Bruce wasn't planning to look jolly. He was planning to hide weapons beneath that oversized costume. In his home in Montrose, Bruce began assembling an arsenal. He purchased 5 9mm handguns. He bought 2 shotguns. He acquired high-octane racing fuel. He built what investigators would later describe as a homemade flamethrower, a rolling air compressor that he converted to spray fuel. He gift-wrapped it in festive paper so it would look like a Christmas present. He rented multiple cars. He packed one with supplies, a computer, clothes, water, food, maps of the southwestern United States and Mexico. He parked that car near the home of Scott Nord, Sylvia's divorce attorney. Investigators believe Bruce planned to kill him too. He purchased a plane ticket for a Christmas morning flight from Los Angeles to Moline, Illinois. He was going to visit a friend in Iowa. Maybe start over somewhere new. He strapped $17,000 in cash to his body, hidden under his clothes. This wasn't an impulsive act of rage. This was calculated, methodical. He'd been planning this for months. Christmas Eve, 2008. The Ortega family gathered at Joseph and Alicia's home on Knollcrest Drive. There were about 25 to 30 people there, siblings, spouses, nieces, nephews, grandchildren. The adults were in the dining room playing poker, laughing, enjoying the holiday. The kids were in the back of the house playing video games. 17-year-old Michael Ortiz was upstairs on the computer. It was warm and loud and full of life. The kind of Christmas Eve that everyone looks forward to. The kind of night that should be filled with nothing but joy and connection. At around 11:30 at night, an 8-year-old girl saw someone walking up the driveway. He was dressed as Santa Claus and carrying presents. Her eyes must have lit up. Santa was here. She ran to the door, excited, and opened it. Bruce shot her in the face. The little girl crumpled to the ground, blood pouring from her cheek. And then Bruce stepped inside and began firing, just shooting at anything that moved. Sylvia, her parents, her siblings, their spouses. He targeted everyone. He wasn't trying to talk. He wasn't trying to negotiate. He was there to kill them all. When he ran out of ammunition, he unwrapped one of his presents and pulled out the homemade flamethrower. He began spraying racing fuel around the living room, coating everything in accelerant. The plan was to ignite it with a flare, to burn the house down with everyone inside, but there was an open flame somewhere. Maybe a candle, maybe the fireplace. The fuel ignited prematurely. There was an explosion. The house erupted in flames. Bruce was caught in the blast. His arms, his legs, the back of his neck all engulfed in fire. Third-degree burns. The polyester pants of his Santa suit melted into his skin. He was in agony, but he still managed to stumble out of the house. He peeled off what he could of the costume. Some of it stayed fused to his burned flesh, and got into his rental car. One of the survivors, a woman named Letitia, made it to a neighbor's house with her husband and 8-year-old daughter. She called 911 and identified Bruce, despite his costume, his beard, his disguise. "I have a feeling I know who it is," she told the dispatcher. "They're going through a divorce right now." It took 80 firefighters an hour and a half to bring the blaze under control. When they finally got inside, they found bodies, charred beyond recognition. Some of the victims had to be identified through dental records. 9 people died that night. Sylvia Ortega Pardo, 43 years old. Her mother, Alicia Sada Ortega, 70. Her father, Joseph S. Ortega, 79. Her brother, Charles Ortega, 50. And his wife, Cherry Lynn Ortega, 45. Her brother, James Ortega, 52. And his wife, Teresa, 52. Her sister, Alicia Ortega Ortiz, 46. And her 17-year-old nephew, Michael Andre Ortiz, who'd been trapped upstairs. 3 others were injured, including the little girl who'd opened the door. She survived, but her face was badly damaged. 13 children were orphaned that night. Others lost one parent. An entire family decimated in minutes. Bruce drove 40 miles to his brother's house in Sylmar. His brother wasn't home. Bruce broke in. He was in so much pain from the burns that he probably knew he wouldn't survive anyway. He couldn't go to a hospital. They'd arrest him on sight. He couldn't flee to Mexico or Illinois. Not in his condition. So Bruce did what cowards do. He put a gun to the roof of his mouth and pulled the trigger. His brother found him around 3:30 in the morning. Christmas Day. Bruce was dead. The medical examiner later found cocaine in his system, something else Bruce had been hiding. Police found remnants of the Santa suit in Bruce's rental car, parked a block away. He'd rigged it to explode. If anyone moved the suit, it would trigger a fire and detonate 200 rounds of ammunition. When the bomb squad tried to dismantle it, the car exploded. Thankfully, no one was hurt. At Bruce's house in Montrose, investigators found what they described as a virtual bomb-making factory. Empty boxes for the 5 handguns. The shotguns, containers for the high-octane fuel. Everything meticulously planned. They also found that second rental car, the one he'd parked near Scott Nord's house, the divorce attorney. It was packed with supplies for a long journey. Maps, food, water. Bruce had planned to kill Scott too, probably in the same way. But the explosion at the Ortega house had burned him so badly that he couldn't go through with the rest of his plans. So why? That's the question everyone always asks. Why would someone do something like this? The FBI later created a profile of Bruce. They determined he likely suffered from extreme narcissism and obsessive-compulsive disorder. He couldn't handle losing. Couldn't handle being exposed. Couldn't handle the idea that people saw him for what he really was. A fraud, a liar, someone who abandoned his own disabled child and then tried to profit off him. The divorce wasn't just a legal proceeding to Bruce. It was a rejection, a humiliation, a public acknowledgement that he'd failed. And rather than take responsibility, rather than change, rather than accept that his actions had consequences, He decided to destroy everything. If he couldn't have Sylvia, if he couldn't have the life he wanted, then no one else could either. Christmas represents family, love, togetherness. For someone like Bruce, who'd spent his life running from his failures, that kind of celebration must have been unbearable. He destroyed it because he wanted to take away what Sylvia loved most. Her family. Sylvia's best friend, Roxanne Jareggi, spoke to reporters after the massacre. She'd known Sylvia for 30 years. She'd almost gone to that Christmas Eve party. She'd been invited. But her parents had come to visit and wanted to go to midnight mass, so she stayed home. "It's eerie," Roxanne said, "because I don't think we would have had a chance to get out." She remembered having lunch with Sylvia just days before the attack. They toasted to Sylvia's new life. Her fresh start. Her freedom from Bruce. When Pardo met Ortega 2 years ago, Roxanne explained, it appeared to be a nice match, but after they got married, he simply wasn't the same person. He just changed. His personality changed. She didn't really feel like he loved her. He didn't care for her. Everything he wanted separate, never really wanted to integrate their lives too much. The divorce, Roxanne said, came down to money. Bruce didn't want to pay. Not even a penny. That's how he was in the marriage too. And for that, for money, for pride, for a bruised ego. 9 people died. An 8-year-old girl was shot in the face. 13 children lost their parents. A grandmother and grandfather, celebrating what should have been a joyous holiday with their family, were murdered in their own home. There's something about this case that stays with you. Maybe it's the timing. Christmas Eve, a night that's supposed to be about peace and goodwill. Maybe it's the cruelty of it, dressing as Santa Claus, the one symbol children associate with joy and gifts, and turning it into an instrument of terror. Maybe it's the little girl opening the door, expecting magic, and instead finding a monster. Or maybe it's the reminder that the people who commit these kinds of atrocities often hide in plain sight. Bruce Pardo had no criminal record, no history of violence. To his neighbors, he was just a guy in a Santa suit heading to a party. They had no idea what he was capable of. The house on Knollcrest Drive stood as a burned-out shell for weeks after the attack. An impromptu memorial sprang up outside, flowers, candles, photos of the victims. The community of Covina held vigils. They created the Ortega Family Fund to help the survivors. But nothing could bring back those 9 lives. Nothing could erase the trauma of what happened that night. In a strange, twisted way, Bruce's own body betrayed him. If the Santa suit hadn't caught fire, if he hadn't been so badly burned, investigators believe he would have gone on to kill Scott Nord. Maybe his own mother. The fire, the very weapon he'd chosen to inflict maximum damage, ended up stopping him from causing even more destruction. But it was too late for the Ortegas. Too late for Sylvia, who'd just been starting her new life. Too late for her parents, who were in their golden years, and should have had more time with their grandchildren. Too late for Michael, only 17, with his whole life ahead of him. So where does that leave us? What do we take away from a story like this? I think it's a reminder that anger, left unchecked, can consume everything. That narcissism, the inability to see beyond your own wounded pride, can turn a person into something monstrous. That the people we trust, the people we let into our lives, can carry darkness we never see until it's too late. But it's also a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. The survivors of that night, like the little girl who was shot, like Letitia and her family who escaped. They carry those scars forever, but they're still here. They survive. And the memory of the Ortega family lives on through them, through the people who love them, through stories like this one. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. This story is over now. Bruce Pardo is gone. The horror of that night in Covina is in the past. But we remember, because those 9 people deserved better. They deserved to finish their poker game, to open presents on Christmas morning, to hug their children and grandchildren and tell them they loved them. They deserve to live. And in remembering them, we honor that. We honor the light they brought into the world, even as we acknowledge the darkness that took them away. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to talk about a case that touched the heart of a small Iowa community. A story about a bright young girl, a community that refused to give up, and a search for answers that took longer than anyone wanted. This is the story of Brazia Terrell. Before we begin, I want you to know that this story does involve difficult topics, but I'll tell it gently, the way you might hear it from a friend over coffee, with respect for everyone involved. So just breathe, relax, and listen. It was the summer of 2020, July in Iowa. You know that kind of summer heat, the kind where the air feels thick and everything moves a little slower. Kids were on summer break, riding bikes, playing video games, soaking up every moment before school started again in the fall. In Davenport, a city along the Mississippi River, 10-year-old Brazia Terrell was doing what most kids her age do during summer vacation. She loved TikTok, like so many kids do. She'd create little dance videos with her mom, Ashia Langford, always smiling. Her family and friends would tell you that Brazia had the biggest personality, the kind of kid who lit up a room just by walking into it. She was a big sister too, which she took seriously. Her younger half-brother, who we'll call DL to protect his privacy, looked up to her. They'd play together, sing songs like Ring Around the Rosie, just being kids. Brazia was caring, creative, always wanting to make people laugh. She was 4'5", about 75 pounds, small for her age, with distinctive black hair that people remembered. She had brown eyes and a smile that, as one family friend put it, you'd see everywhere she went. On Thursday, July 9th, 2020, Brazia was excited. She was going to spend the night at her half-brother DL's place. DL was staying with his father, Henry Earl Dinkins, and Dinkins' girlfriend, Andrea Culberson, at their apartment in the 2700 block of East 53rd Street in Davenport. Now, Henry Dinkins was 48 years old at the time. He was DL's biological father, and though he and Ashia Langford, Brazia's mother, weren't together anymore, they shared custody of their son. Brazia and DL were half-siblings through their mother, and the kids loved spending time together. That evening, everything seemed normal. The kids were playing video games in the bedroom, laughing, having fun the way kids do on a summer night when they don't have to wake up early the next day. Around 9 or 10 o'clock that night, Brazia borrowed Dinkins' phone to text her mom. "Good night, Mom," she typed. Moments later, Aishia responded, "Good night. I love you, Brazia. Thank you." Those would be the last words Brazia would ever send to her mother. Andrea Culberson, Dinkins' girlfriend, said she went to bed around 11:30 that night. The kids were still awake, still playing their games. Everything seemed fine, normal, just another summer night. But when Andrea woke up around 3 o'clock in the morning to use the bathroom, something felt off immediately. Brazia wasn't in the bed. And as Andrea looked around the apartment, she realized both Brazia and Dinkins were gone. She felt it in her stomach. That sick feeling. That instant knowing that something was wrong. Where would they have gone at 3 in the morning? Why would Dinkins take Brazia anywhere at that hour? Then about 30 minutes later, Dinkins returned to the apartment, alone. Andrea watched from the bedroom window as he went to the closet and grabbed something, though she couldn't quite see what it was. And that's when she saw Brazia, standing outside by Dinkins' maroon Chevrolet Impala. Andrea could see her clearly because of Brazia's distinctive hair, and because of the oversized shirt she was wearing, a 4XL t-shirt that Dinkins had given both kids to wear to bed. It practically swallowed Brazia's small frame. Moments later, Dinkins and Brazia left again. And then, nothing. silent. When Dinkins returned sometime after sunrise, he was alone. Brazier was nowhere to be found. Friday morning, July 10th, began like any other morning for Aisha Langford. She was scheduled to work at Checkers restaurant on Locust Street, and her manager texted her early asking if she could come in to help with opening. She brushed her teeth, hurried out the door, and arrived at work at 8:04 in the morning. 4 minutes later, her world began to crumble. Dinkins called her. He told her he'd woken up and Brazier was gone. Just gone. He said he was going downtown to file a police report, but he never did. Instead, Ayesha was the one who called the Davenport Police Department at 8:08 that morning, reporting her daughter missing. Her 10-year-old daughter who had spent the night at her ex's apartment and had somehow vanished between the hours of darkness and dawn. The police responded quickly. They began searching Credit Island, a park area near where Brazier was last seen. They talked to Dinkins. They talked to Andrea. They talked to young DL, who was only 8 years old and confused and scared about where his sister had gone. As the hours turned into days, the Davenport Police Department launched a full investigation. This wasn't a case of a child wandering off. Sergeant Jeffrey Pfeiffer, one of the first officers to respond, would later testify that all the evidence showed Brazier didn't run away. This was something else. On July 14th, 4 days after Brazier disappeared, police officially named Henry Dinkins as a person of interest. They didn't call him a suspect yet, but they had questions. A lot of questions. See, Dinkins had a history. Back in 1990, when he was just 17 years old, he'd been convicted of third-degree sexual abuse involving a girl under 14. He was a registered sex offender, and he'd recently violated the terms of his registration. On July 10th, the very day Brazier disappeared, Dinkins was booked on sex offender registration and probation violation charges. The police started piecing together Dinkins' movements that night and early morning, and what they found painted a disturbing picture. Let me walk you through what investigators discovered. Slowly, piece by piece, the way they uncovered it. At 3:31 in the morning on July 10th, surveillance cameras caught Dinkins at the Quick Shop at 201 West 53rd Street. He was getting out of his red Impala, well, maroon actually, a 2007 Chevy Impala that he drove regularly. Then the car appeared on multiple surveillance cameras heading north toward Clinton County. The car was seen in the city limits of Clinton, Iowa, about a 30-minute drive from Davenport. After 7 in the morning, more surveillance footage showed Dinkins at a Walmart in Clinton. Security cameras recorded him buying 2 bottles of bleach. 2 bottles of bleach. When police later searched that Impala, they found the empty boxes for those bleach bottles. They also found something else. When they opened the trunk, detectives immediately smelled it. Bleach. Strong, unmistakable. And in that trunk they found an axe. When a crime scene technician shined a blue light on the metal part of the axe, she observed what appeared to be blood. The car had also been seen on Highway 30 near 400th Avenue in Clinton County. An officer performing a grid search in that area found a cell phone, a battery, and a phone case lying just off the shoulder of the road. The battery had been removed from the phone. Later, young D would tell investigators that when he was in the car with his father, he found a phone with the battery taken out. He said he put the battery back in and turned the phone on for a short time, and there was more. Court documents revealed that at some point that morning, Dinkins crashed his vehicle into a ditch on Highway 61 in Clinton County. A man named Jared Brink stopped to help him. Brink helped Dinkins pull the car out of the ditch. This happened around 4:30 in the morning. When police later asked Brink if he knew what was in the vehicle, he said he didn't, but he remembered the location, and it was close, very close to a place that would become significant months later. This time, the community had mobilized. Hundreds of volunteers showed up to search for Brazier. They walked through fields, searched along roads, checked every place they could think of. Aisha Langford and her family created what they called Bramobiles. Vehicles decorated with Brazier's photo, packed with missing person posters. They drove everywhere, posted flyers on every corner, knocked on doors, talked to anyone who would listen. An Amber Alert was issued on July 15th. The FBI got involved, offering a $10,000 reward for information. Special agents reviewed cell phone records, participated in searches, provided technical resources. The case was featured on Investigation Discovery's In Pursuit the Missing in March of 2021. By then, Brazia had been missing for months. Her 11th birthday came and went on December 4th, 2020. The FBI's Omaha office tweeted out a birthday message, still asking for information, still offering that reward. But there were no answers. No Brazia, just questions and worry. And a mother who couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, couldn't stop wondering where her daughter was. She's out there somewhere, Isia told reporters. And when she's home safe, that's when the story begins. That's when she'll tell us what happened. She still had hope, still believed Brazia was alive, maybe being held somewhere against her will, but alive. Winter turned to spring. March 22nd, 2021. Two fishermen were out near DeWitt, Iowa, in a rural area of Clinton County, about 3 miles north of the town. They were near a small pond, the kind of hidden, quiet place where most people never venture. The area was remote, with thick vegetation, hard to access. The driveway leading to it was so steep you couldn't really drive down it. And there in that nearly hidden pond, they found something that made them immediately call the police. Human remains. The Division of Criminal Investigation arrived. They spent March 23rd carefully, methodically removing the remains from the pond. The process was delicate, respectful, but also thorough. They needed to preserve any evidence they could find. On March 31st, 2021, Davenport Police Chief Paul Sikorsky held a press conference. He delivered what he called heartbreaking news. The remains found outside DeWitt were confirmed to be those of Brazia Terrell. 9 months. She'd been missing for 9 months. And now, the worst fears of everyone who loved her had been confirmed. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. Brazia had been shot, not once, but multiple times. At least 2 bullets had struck her, and a third projectile was found in her hair. They also found that oversized 4XL t-shirt near her remains, the one she'd been wearing to bed that night. In April, detectives visited Isia Langford to deliver the medical examiner's findings in person. Can you imagine? Can you imagine being a mother and having to hear that? On May 5, 2021, Scott County Attorney Mike Walton held a press conference. Henry Earl Dinkins was being charged with first-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping in the death of Brazia Terrell. While announcing charges is a significant step in this case, Walton said, "It is important to understand that bringing forth charges is not the end of the legal process, but just the beginning. The case will now proceed to court." On June 16, 2021, Dinkins pled not guilty, and so began a long, complicated journey through the legal system. Dinkins was representing himself for a while, which is always unusual in a case this serious. He requested new attorneys multiple times. He asked for his trial to be moved out of Scott County because of pretrial publicity, and Judge Henry Latham granted that request in March 2022. The trial was scheduled to be held in Lynn County, but then, on August 8, 2023, the day that jury selection was set to begin, Dinkins made a surprising decision. He waived his right to a jury trial. He wanted a bench trial instead, meaning a judge would decide his fate rather than a jury of his peers. Because of that decision, the case moved back to Scott County, and Judge Latham would hear the case. The trial began on August 10, 2023, more than 3 years after Brazia disappeared. More than 2 years after her remains were found. Scott County Attorney Kelly Cunningham laid out the timeline for Judge Latham. She walked through everything, step by step: the sleepover, the surveillance footage, the bleach purchase, the crashed car, the location of Brazia's remains. But there was a problem for the prosecution. Despite all this circumstantial evidence, there was very little physical evidence directly tying Dinkins to the crime. No blood from Brazia in the car. No DNA that definitively proved he'd touched her. No witnesses who saw him harm her. The defense, led by attorney Chad Freis, argued exactly this point. "There is not one piece of evidence that shows Henry Dinkins touched this girl," Freis said. "We don't convict people on theories." FBI analysts testified that very little of the evidence collected could be linked to Henry Dinkins or Brazia Terrell. Forensic experts from the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, reported that they found no blood on the axe from the trunk. just one fingerprint on all the evidence they examined. But then came the witnesses, and their testimony began to fill in the gaps. Andrea Culberson, Dinkins' girlfriend at the time, took the stand. She described waking up at 3 in the morning and feeling scared when she realized Berbregia and Dinkins were both gone. She testified about seeing Berbregia standing by the car in that oversized shirt. She remembered how distinctively Berbregia's hair looked even in the darkness. Berbregia's mother, Aisha Langford, testified about that morning, about the frantic calls to Dinkins, about him saying he woke up and Berbregia was gone, about him saying he was going to file a police report, but never doing it. And then there was young D.L., Berbregia's half-brother, and Dinkins' son, now 11 years old. He had to take the stand and talk about the worst night of his life. D.L. testified that on July 10th he went to Credit Island with his father. He saw Dinkins cleaning a machete with bleach at the motorhome. Dinkins kept near Schmidt Road. He described his father pulling out a big knife and wiping it down. When detectives later searched that motorhome, they found a machete on top of the refrigerator that matched D.L.'s description. But then, during cross-examination, D.L. said something that hadn't been in any of his previous statements to police, something he'd apparently been too afraid to say, too traumatized to speak about. He said he saw his father shoot Berbregia. The defense attorney asked him why he was only now mentioning this, why he'd left it out of his earlier statements. "I didn't leave it out," D.L. said quietly. "I didn't speak about it. I hate speaking about it." Later, he added that he was afraid to tell people what he'd seen. When Aisha took the stand, the defense asked her if D.L. was prone to exaggerating. "Depends," she answered. "But not about his sister. He wouldn't lie about that." Judge Latham would later say that D.L.'s testimony was especially significant. This young boy who had to live with the trauma of what he'd witnessed, who had lost his sister and was testifying against his own father. Throughout the trial, prosecutors built their case piece by piece. They showed the jury the surveillance footage of Dinkins buying bleach at Walmart. They presented the foam that was found on Highway 30 with the battery removed. They brought in FBI geologists who testified that 3 out of 10 soil samples from the trunk of Dinkins' Impala matched the soil where Berbregia's remains were found. Members of the Big River dive team testified about recovering evidence from the pond, including a revolver that police believed was the murder weapon. They described the murky water, the difficult conditions, the careful process of retrieving everything they could find. One crucial piece of evidence came from Gerard Brink, the man who'd helped pull Dinkins' car out of the ditch that morning. Sadly, Brink had died of a heart attack in June 2023, before the trial. But his deposition testimony was allowed to be read into the record. Brink had come forward to police after Berbregia's remains were found. He had been with a friend, discussing the discovery, and learned where the body had been recovered. "I pulled a black man's maroon Impala from a ditch, not far from there," Brink told his friend. That friend encouraged him to call the police. When law enforcement collected GPS data from Brink's cell phone, it confirmed he was in that exact area on July 10th, 2020. According to prosecutors, this was the final piece of evidence that prompted Dinkins' arrest for murder. Prosecutors argued that Dinkins had sexually assaulted Berbregia that night. They believed he killed her because he was afraid she would tell someone what he'd done. As a registered sex offender already facing violations, another sexual assault charge could have meant decades in prison. They theorized that he took her from the apartment in the early morning hours, perhaps to the motorhome where D.L. saw him later. At some point in that remote area near DeWitt, he shot her. Then he attempted to hide her body in the pond, tried to clean up the evidence with bleach, and crashed his car while driving in an area he wasn't familiar with in the darkness. The defense argued this was all speculation. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence. They suggested police had focused too heavily on Dinkins and hadn't investigated other possibilities. They even mentioned another murder that had occurred in Clinton about 10 days after Berbregia disappeared, suggesting maybe there was a connection that police hadn't explored. But at the end of the day, after 14 days of testimony, 47 witnesses, and roughly 70 hours of court proceedings, the evidence painted a clear picture in Judge Latham's mind. The trial ended on August 29th, 2023, with closing arguments. Then everyone waited. Judge Latham said he would issue his ruling as quickly as I can, but Iowa law required a written decision, and the judge wanted to be thorough. This case was too important to rush. On September 15th, 2023, Judge Latham called everyone back to the courtroom. The courtroom was packed with Breza's family, all wearing purple in her honor. Judge Latham explained that he could simply read the verdict and file his written decision, but he'd chosen not to do that. "I think this case, due to the crime involved, is very important," he said, "and I find that it's appropriate that I read the entire decision today." And then, after carefully recounting the evidence, explaining his reasoning, walking through every piece of the case, Judge Latham delivered his verdict. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of first-degree kidnapping. The courtroom broke into applause. People hugged Aisha Langford. She later said, "I don't know how to feel. I feel like I just won the lottery." But it wasn't really winning, was it? Brejza was still gone. No verdict could bring her back. On October 11th, 2023, Henry Earl Dinkins returned to court for sentencing. Aisha Langford gave an emotional victim impact statement. She said she couldn't forgive Dinkins. She talked about how her son still deals with anger and trauma from what Dinkins put him through. She spoke about the hole in their family that would never be filled. "Closure doesn't exist in this case," she said. "Justice doesn't exist in this case." Judge Latham sentenced Dinkins to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for murder and one for kidnapping. The judge cited Dinkins' previous criminal history and his lack of remorse for the crime. His history, coupled with the horrific nature of his offenses against his own child's sister, requires that this defendant be removed from society for the protection of society and community. The judge stated, "Henry Earl Dinkins, now 51 years old, will spend the rest of his life in prison." When we talk about true crime cases, sometimes we focus so much on the details of what happened, on the investigation and the trial, that we forget about the person at the center of it all. Brejza Terrell was 10 years old. She loved TikTok. She loved dancing with her mom. She was a caring big sister who took that role seriously. She had the biggest personality, the kind of smile you'd remember. She should have grown up. She should have graduated from middle school, high school, maybe college. She should have had first dates and driver's licenses and all those normal milestones of growing up. Instead, her life was cut short on a July night in 2020 by someone who was supposed to protect children, not harm them. Her family organized memorial walks. They created the Bree-mobiles, covered in her photo. They refused to let her be forgotten, and in DeWitt, near where her remains were found, there's a memorial. People leave flowers there. They leave notes. They remember. Aisha Langford told reporters after the verdict that she could finally breathe again, because he took that away from me, she said. To be able to comfortably move around and be able to breathe. And now I can breathe again. But she also knows that breathing and healing are 2 different things. The trauma of losing a child, of waiting 9 months for answers, of going through years of legal proceedings. That doesn't just go away because a verdict is reached. Her younger son, DL, lives with what he witnessed. He has to carry that with him for the rest of his life. He lost his sister, and in many ways he lost his father too. Cases like this remind us of something important. They remind us to pay attention to the people in our children's lives, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong. Andrea Culberson woke up at 3 in the morning and felt scared, felt sick to her stomach, because something was wrong. She knew it immediately. They also remind us of the power of community. Hundreds of people searched for Brejza. Volunteers gave up their time to walk through fields and along roadsides. People put up posters, shared information, refused to give up hope. Even when that hope turned to grief, the community stood together. And they remind us that justice, when it comes, doesn't erase the pain. It doesn't bring back what was lost. But it does matter. It matters that Henry Dinkins will never hurt another child. It matters that Brejza's story was heard, that the truth came out, that someone was held accountable. If you're falling asleep now, that's okay. Let yourself rest. But maybe, before you drift off completely, think about Brejza. Think about that 10-year-old girl with the big smile and the bigger personality. Think about the family who loved her and continues to love her. And if you have children in your life, whether they're your own kids, nieces, nephews, students, neighbors, hold them a little closer. Pay attention to who they're spending time with. Trust your instincts. Speak up when something feels wrong, because every child deserves to grow up safe. Every child deserves to have their childhood. To make TikTok videos with their mom, to be a big sister, to just be a kid. Brejza Terrell deserved all of that, and we remember her. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, I want to tell you a story. It's a true story, one that happened not too long ago in the warm sunshine of Southwest Florida. It's a story about ambition and dreams, about a woman who wanted to heal people, and about how sometimes the people closest to us can hide the darkest secrets. Take a deep breath. This is the story of Dr. Teresa Shivers. Picture Southwest Florida in 2006. The palm trees swaying gently in the Gulf breeze. The sun warming the sand on Bonita Springs Beach. It's the kind of place people move to when they want a fresh start, when they're chasing a dream. That's what Teresa Shivers was doing. She was chasing a dream. Teresa wasn't originally from Florida. She was born on November 19th, 1968 in Derby, Connecticut, a small New England town where everyone knew everyone. Her parents separated when she was just a month old, so she was raised by her mother. From the time she was in 6th grade, Teresa knew what she wanted to be. She wanted to be a doctor. It wasn't just a passing fancy, you know. Some kids say they want to be astronauts or firefighters, and then they grow up and become accountants. Not Teresa. She was determined. She was focused. In high school, she became valedictorian of her class. The smartest student, the one who gave the speech at graduation while everyone's parents took pictures. She went to Fairfield University, got her pre-med education sorted out, and then in 1996, she graduated from Ross University School of Medicine in Dominica. That's a small island in the Caribbean. Beautiful place. Then she completed her residency at the University of Florida, where she was actually named Resident of the Year. She wasn't just good at medicine. She was exceptional. Teresa specialized in internal medicine at first. The traditional stuff. Blood pressure, cholesterol, prescriptions. But somewhere along the way, she started to feel like something was missing. Like Western medicine, for all its power, wasn't seeing the whole picture. She got interested in holistic medicine, integrative healing, the kind of approach that looks at the whole person, not just the symptoms. She went back to school, added certifications in anti-aging medicine, regenerative medicine, functional medicine. She even started exploring energy healing, which was pretty bold for a medical doctor in those days. Her patients loved her for it. They said she actually listened to them. She'd spend time asking about their lives, their stress, their emotional well-being. She believed that disease wasn't just about genetics or bad luck, that sometimes it was about unresolved emotional pain manifesting in the body. People started coming from all over to see her. Now, Teresa's personal life had been a bit complicated. She'd been married once before, but that marriage ended. And then in 2003, she met Mark Shivers. He was the brother of one of her friends. Mark was a nurse from Missouri, and when they met, there was a spark. They fell in love. They got married. Mark and Teresa had 2 daughters together. 2 little girls who would grow up in the Florida sunshine, swimming in pools, going to the beach, living that picture-perfect life. In 2006, the family moved to Bonita Springs, Florida, and Teresa and Mark opened up their own practice. It was called Restorative Health and Healing Center, and it was located in Estero, just a short drive away. Teresa was the doctor, the healer, the one with the vision. Mark handled the business side, the scheduling, the office management. He also took care of the girls while Teresa worked long hours with patients. From the outside, they looked like they had it all figured out. A beautiful home in a gated community. A successful medical practice. 2 healthy daughters. The American dream right there in Southwest Florida. Teresa even started a YouTube channel. She wanted to reach more people, share her message about holistic health with the world. She had this dream of maybe getting her own TV show one day, becoming a wellness guru who could help people across the country. She'd tell her viewers, getting you healthy is my passion. Being healthy is your choice. She was board certified in both internal medicine and anti-aging medicine. She offered nutritional counseling, weight loss programs, detoxification, hormone therapy. She integrated traditional Western medicine with alternative approaches. Her patients adored her. They left reviews saying she'd saved their lives, that she held their hands and prayed with them, that she was the most compassionate doctor they'd ever met. But you know how it is. Sometimes the life people see from the outside isn't the whole story. Let's talk about Mark for a minute. Mark Sievers grew up in Missouri. He'd been friends with a guy named Curtis Wainwright Jr. since they were kids. Went to school together. That whole thing. Curtis and Mark, they were close. Really close. Like brothers, people said. Now, Curtis wasn't exactly living a straight and narrow life. He had what you'd call a lengthy rap sheet, a career criminal. In and out of trouble. But Mark stayed friends with him anyway. That's the thing about childhood friendships sometimes. They have roots that go deep, even when maybe they shouldn't. By 2015, Teresa and Mark had been married for 12 years. They had their 2 daughters, aged 11 and 8. The girls were getting older, needing more attention, more involvement from both parents. And the cracks in the marriage were starting to show. Neighbors would later tell police that they'd heard arguing coming from the Sievers house. Not just little disagreements, but real fights. The kind where voices get raised and doors get slammed. Mark was worried. People said he was afraid that Teresa was going to leave him, and that she'd take the girls with her. He told friends he couldn't afford a custody battle. And there was something else. Money. See, the practice was doing well, but there were expenses. Lots of expenses. And Mark had taken out life insurance policies on Teresa. 5 of them, actually. Together they totaled $4,433,000. That's a lot of money. More money than most people will see in their entire lives. In the spring of 2015, Mark went to Missouri to attend Curtis Wainwright's wedding. These 2 childhood friends, reuniting for this happy occasion. And sometime during that visit, Mark confided in Curtis. He told him about his marriage problems. He said Teresa was threatening to leave. He said he was afraid of losing his daughters. He said he couldn't afford to fight her for custody. And Curtis, according to what would come out later, Curtis told Mark there was only one option. Teresa had to die. Mark agreed. He said he'd pay Curtis to help him. They started planning how to kill Teresa. Mark also wanted Teresa dead for the insurance money, of course. $4 million can solve a lot of problems. Curtis later testified that Mark promised him $100,000 or more to make it happen. Now, Curtis didn't plan to do this alone. He brought in another guy, Jimmy Ray Rogers. Jimmy was someone Curtis had met while they were both in jail in Missouri back in 2010. Jimmy had his own criminal history, his own troubles with the law. Curtis promised to pay Jimmy too, split the money, get the job done, get away with it. On the morning of June 27, 2015, Curtis Wainwright rented a car from a place in Hillsboro, Missouri. Then he picked up Jimmy Rogers, and the 2 of them started driving. They had a long trip ahead of them, over 1,000 miles from Missouri to Bonita Springs, Florida. They drove all day, all night, stopping at gas stations to fill up, to use the bathroom, to grab snacks and energy drinks. They had no idea that they were leaving a digital trail with every stop. Security cameras, GPS data from the rental car, cell phone towers pinging their location. Technology, it's everywhere now. There's no such thing as disappearing anymore. Meanwhile, Teresa Sievers was with her family. She and Mark and their 2 daughters had traveled to Connecticut to visit Teresa's family. It was her mother's birthday, a time for celebration. The girls were having fun, seeing their grandmother, and aunts and uncles, enjoying a little summer vacation. But Teresa had patients scheduled. She had appointments on Monday morning back in Florida, and she didn't want to cancel on people who were counting on her. So on Sunday, June 28th, she made the decision to fly home early. She'd go back to Florida, see her patients on Monday, and Mark and the girls could finish out the vacation and drive home in a few days. Mark drove Teresa to LaGuardia Airport in New York City. There's surveillance footage of them at the airport, Mark giving Teresa a kiss goodbye before she headed through security. Just a husband and wife saying goodbye, or so it looked. Teresa flew to Southwest Florida International Airport. The flight was uneventful. She landed late Sunday night around 11:30. She was seen on airport security cameras, pulling her suitcase, heading out to find her car in the parking lot. She looked tired but happy, ready to get home and get some sleep before her busy Monday. She drove the short distance from the airport to her house in Bonita Springs. It was after midnight by the time she pulled into the driveway of her home on Jarvis Road. The house was in a nice neighborhood, quiet and safe. Or at least it was supposed to be. Curtis and Jimmy had been waiting for hours. They'd arrived at the Seavers house around 6 that morning, using information Mark had given them. They knew the security code to disable the alarm. They went inside, turned off the alarm system, and then they left again. They had time to kill, so they went shopping. At a local Walmart, security cameras captured Curtis and Jimmy walking through the aisles. They seemed relaxed, not nervous at all. They bought black towels, black shoes, wet wipes, trash bags, and a lock-picking kit. Everything you might need if you were planning to commit a crime and clean up afterward. After Walmart, they drove to a beach and waited some more. Spending time by the ocean, maybe thinking about what they were about to do. Or maybe not thinking about it at all. Who knows what goes through someone's mind when they're preparing to take a life. Eventually, as the sun was setting, they drove back to the Seavers house. They waited in the darkness. Hours passed, and then finally they saw headlights. Teresa pulled into the driveway. She got out of her car, grabbed her suitcase from the trunk, and walked toward her front door. Home at last. Ready for bed. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and that's when they attacked her. What happened next was brutal, swift and vicious. Teresa was struck with a hammer 17 times. The medical examiner would later say the attack was so savage, so overwhelming, that she likely died within seconds. She was ambushed in her own kitchen, the heart of her home, a place where she should have been safe. Curtis and Jimmy didn't linger. They grabbed what they needed, cleaned up as best they could, and drove away in the early morning darkness. They left the hammer behind, evidence. But at the time they thought they'd gotten away with it. They drove back to Missouri, more than 1,000 miles. Retracing their route, on the way, Curtis told Jimmy to throw some things out of the car window. A blue jumpsuit that had fibers matching Teresa's dress. Evidence being scattered along the side of the highway in rural Missouri. The next morning, Monday, June 29th, Teresa didn't show up for work. Her staff at the medical practice started calling her. No answer. They called again. Still nothing. This wasn't like Teresa. She was responsible, dedicated. She wouldn't just not show up without calling. Her employees called Mark, who was still up in Connecticut with the girls. Mark asked a neighbor, another doctor named Mark Petritz, to go check on Teresa. Maybe she'd overslept. Maybe her phone had died. Dr. Petritz went to the house. The door was unlocked. He walked inside, calling Teresa's name. And then he found her. She was lying on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. The back of her head was destroyed. There was a hammer nearby. Dr. Petritz, shaking, called 911. "I'm at a friend's house," he told the dispatcher, his voice breaking. "He's out of town, and I came here to check on his wife. And she's dead on the floor. There's a hammer at the side, and she's bashed in the back of the head." The police arrived quickly. The house became a crime scene. Yellow tape. Detectives. Forensic teams. Teresa Seavers, the beloved holistic doctor, had been murdered in her own home. The investigation began immediately, but there weren't many leads. The house hadn't been ransacked. There was a safe in the home with more than $40,000 in cash, completely untouched. So this wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was targeted. This was personal. But who would want Teresa dead? The police looked at all the usual angles. Disgruntled patients. Teresa worked with troubled teen moms through a local charity. Could one of them have done this? Maybe someone with a grudge against holistic medicine. That was even a bizarre conspiracy theory floating around online at the time, because 2 other holistic doctors in Florida had died that same month. Was there a serial killer targeting alternative medicine practitioners? Detectives followed every lead, but nothing panned out. There was no physical evidence left behind. No fingerprints. No DNA. It was, as prosecutor Cynthia Ross would later say, almost the perfect crime. For nearly 2 months, the case went cold. Mark Seavers, meanwhile, was playing the role of the grieving husband. He held a funeral for Teresa, stood up in front of everyone and said, "I was and still am the luckiest man in the world." But detectives were watching him. Something about his grief didn't feel right. It felt performed. Exaggerated. Lieutenant David Labid later said that Mark seemed fake. They'd met a lot of people who'd lost loved ones, and Mark's reactions just didn't ring true. Plus, there were some troubling things. Hours after Teresa's funeral, investigators watched Mark throw computer equipment into a dumpster behind the couple's medical office. Why would someone do that? What was he trying to hide? Mark had been cooperative at first, handing over his cell phone to investigators. But once he hired a lawyer, he stopped talking to the police entirely. That's his right, of course. But it made detectives suspicious. And then in August 2015, the case broke wide open. A tipster from Missouri called the police. This person told investigators that a man named Curtis Wayne Wright had confessed to killing Teresa Shivers. He told someone about it, and that someone decided to do the right thing and call the authorities. Detectives in Florida started looking into Curtis Wayne Wright, career criminal from Missouri. Lengthy record. And then they discovered something interesting. Curtis was Mark Seaver's childhood best friend. They'd grown up together. They'd stayed in touch their whole lives. The police expanded their investigation to include Jimmy Ray Rogers, Curtis's associate. And that's when the digital evidence started piling up. The GPS system from the rental car showed the entire route, Missouri to Florida and back. Every address they'd entered, including the Walmart and the Seavers' home address. Cell phone tower data confirmed their location. Security footage from the gas station showed Curtis and Jimmy on their road trip. Security footage from Walmart showed them buying suspicious items. In August 2015, police arrested Curtis Wayne Wright and Jimmy Ray Rogers in Missouri. Both men were charged with murder. And then the police talked to Jimmy's girlfriend, a woman named Taylor Showmaker. She told them something chilling. She said that Jimmy had confessed to her. She said he'd told her that Mark had hired Curtis, who had then hired Jimmy to murder Teresa for life insurance money. Taylor even led police to a spot along Highway 47 in Missouri, where Jimmy had told her to throw a blue jumpsuit out of the car window. Investigators found it. Forensic analysis showed that fibers from the jumpsuit matched fibers found on Teresa's dress. The case against Curtis and Jimmy was solid. But what about Mark? In December 2015, 5 months after Teresa's murder, Mark Seavers was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Police believed he was the mastermind, the one who set everything in motion. Mark's mother-in-law, Teresa's mother Marianne Groves, was granted custody of the two girls. Mark wouldn't see his daughters as a free man again. The trials took years to unfold. These things always do. The wheels of justice turned slowly. In 2017, Curtis Wayne Wright made a plea deal. He agreed to testify against both Jimmy Rogers and Mark Seavers in exchange for a reduced sentence. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In his testimony, Curtis said that Mark had approached him about killing Teresa, that Mark was afraid of losing custody of his daughters and wanted the insurance money, that Mark had promised to pay him $100,000 or more. Curtis said that he and Jimmy had driven from Missouri to Florida, waited for Teresa to come home, and then killed her with a hammer. In October 2019, Jimmy Ray Rogers went to trial. His defense attorneys argued that Curtis was lying, trying to pin everything on Jimmy to save himself. They pointed out that there was no DNA evidence, placing Jimmy at the scene. But the GPS data, the surveillance footage, the testimony from Taylor Showmaker, Curtis's testimony, it was all too much. The jury found Jimmy Rogers guilty of second-degree murder and trespassing. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Then came Mark's trial. Mark Seavers' trial began in December 2019. The prosecution's case was built largely on Curtis Wayne Wright's testimony. Mark's defense attorneys tried to paint Curtis as an unreliable witness. After all, he was a murderer who'd lied to police initially. Could the jury really trust him? But there was other evidence too. The computer equipment Mark had thrown away, his odd behavior after Teresa's death, the life insurance policies, the GPS data and surveillance footage that put Curtis and Jimmy in Florida at the exact time of the murder, Mark's own words to Curtis about wanting Teresa dead. The jury deliberated, and on December 4, 2019, they found Mark Seavers guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. On January 3, 2020, Mark Seavers was sentenced to death. He stood before the judge and said he was innocent and heartbroken, that Teresa was his soulmate. But the judge didn't believe him. Mark was sent to Union Correctional Institution in Florida, where he remains on death row. Now, the thing about this case that stays with people is how calculated it was. How Mark didn't just want his wife dead. He wanted to be far away when it happened. He wanted an alibi. He was with his daughters in Connecticut, playing the doting father, while his childhood friend drove 1,000 miles to brutally murder his wife. Teresa's family was devastated, of course. Her mother, Mary Ann, took custody of the two girls, who lost both of their parents in one terrible act. Teresa's sister said the family was heartbroken, but also grateful that justice had been served. The digital evidence was crucial. Without that GPS data, without the security camera footage, without the cell phone towers tracking Curtis and Jimmy's every move, this case might never have been solved. Technology, for all its flaws, helped bring 3 killers to justice. Mark Shivers continues to maintain his innocence. He's filed appeals arguing that Curtis's testimony shouldn't have been allowed, that the trial was unfair. But so far his conviction and death sentence have been upheld. Curtis Wayne Wright is serving his 25-year sentence. He'll be eligible for release one day, though he'll be an old man by then. Jimmy Ray Rogers is serving life without parole. He's given interviews from prison, claiming he's innocent, saying that Curtis was the only one who hit Teresa. But the jury didn't believe him. And Teresa Shivers is remembered by her patients, her family, and her community as a compassionate healer. Someone who genuinely cared about helping people. Her mother established a scholarship fund in her name to help medical students pursue careers in holistic and integrative medicine, carrying on Teresa's legacy. So that's the story. A woman with a dream of healing people, betrayed by the man who promised to love her. A carefully planned murder carried out by 2 criminals who thought they could get away with it, and an investigation that used modern technology to track them down and bring them to justice. It's a story about greed, about fear, about the dark things people are capable of when they decide money and control are more important than human life. But it's also a story about Teresa, about a girl from Connecticut who became valedictorian, who went to medical school in the Caribbean, who built a successful practice helping people find wellness, who had dreams of reaching even more people, of sharing her message with the world. She didn't get to fulfill all those dreams, but she did touch countless lives. Her patients loved her. Her daughters will always remember her, and in that way her light still shines. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. You know how sometimes the most ordinary moments change everything? A woman walking her dog on a cold January morning in 2016. The kind of morning where your breath turns to mist and the world feels quiet, almost sacred. She was following the familiar path through West Bank State Park in Ohio, just off Highway 127, when her dog stopped, started sniffing around something near Coldwater Creek. At first, she thought it might be a fallen branch. The woods there are thick, the kind of place where nature reclaims everything eventually. But as she got closer, she realized what she was looking at wasn't wood at all. It was bone. Human bone. The woman called the authorities, her hands probably shaking as she dialed. And just like that, a mystery began. A mystery that would take nearly 6 years to solve, weaving through the lives of people connected by the internet, by desire, by choices that spiraled into something dark and irreversible. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not to that cold January morning, but earlier, to a young man named Ryan Zimmerman. Ryan was 21 years old, living in Corbin, Kentucky with his family. By all accounts, he was a gentle soul, loved video games, spent hours on his computer, lost in worlds where he could be anyone, do anything. He was close with his younger brother, the kind of older sibling who'd make time to play, to talk, to just be there. His family knew him as quiet, thoughtful, maybe a little shy. But like so many young people, Ryan was searching for something, trying to figure out who he was, what he wanted, where he belonged in this world. He'd been exploring his identity online, asking questions about himself that he maybe couldn't ask out loud. Questions about sexuality, about gender, about possibilities. In the spring of 2015, Ryan did what millions of people do every day. He posted an ad on Craigslist. It was in the personal section. Back when that existed, he was looking for connection, for someone who might understand what he was going through. The ad was explicit about what he wanted, what he was curious about, and someone responded. The screen name was Laurel Emerson. They started talking, first through email, then on Google Hangouts. The conversations grew more intimate, more detailed. Laurel seemed to understand Ryan in a way few people did. They talked about desires, about identities, about possibilities, and eventually Laurel extended an invitation. "Come to Columbus," he said. "Live with me. Explore who you really are." Ryan said yes, but here's the thing about the internet. Behind every screen name is a person, and sometimes that person isn't quite who they seem to be. Laurel Emerson wasn't really named Laurel. That was a persona, a digital mask worn by a man named Corey Buzzard. Corey was married to a woman named Sarah, and in the summer of 2015, they were living in an apartment complex called Skyview Townhomes in Columbus, Ohio. Now, Corey and Sarah's marriage wasn't exactly traditional. They'd opened up their relationship in ways that worked for them, or at least they thought it did. And when Corey met Ryan online, he saw an opportunity, someone young, searching, willing to explore. He invited Ryan to become part of their lives, to live with them, to have an intimate relationship with him. On August 6, 2015, Ryan packed up his things and made the drive from Corbin, Kentucky to Columbus, Ohio. Think about that moment for him. The nervousness, the excitement, the hope. He was 21 years old, driving toward what he thought might be a new life, a new version of himself. When Ryan arrived at the apartment, the situation was more complicated than he might have expected. Corey and Sarah weren't living alone. There was a third person there, a woman named Naira Whitaker. Naira had moved in just a month earlier. In July, she was in a relationship with Sarah. So you had this apartment with 4 people, this web of connections and intimacies that most of us would find hard to navigate. So for the first few weeks, things seemed to work. Ryan was with Corey. Sarah was with Naira. Everyone had their place in this unconventional arrangement. But these kinds of situations, they're fragile, built on communication and boundaries that have to be maintained constantly. And when they break hard. By late September, something had shifted. Corey had changed his mind about Ryan. Whatever connection they'd had, whatever arrangement they'd agreed to, Corey didn't want it anymore. He told Ryan he needed to leave. Pack your things. Find somewhere else to go. Ryan's last communication with his family in Kentucky was on September 25, 2015. Just a regular conversation. Nothing that suggested anything was wrong. No final goodbye. Just normal life. The kind of mundane exchange that only becomes significant in hindsight. That same weekend, September 25th through the 27th, Corey Buzzard checked into the Hyatt Regency Hotel downtown with someone visiting from Athens, Ohio. He left the apartment, left Sarah and Naira and Ryan together. Now here's where we need to talk about Sarah. Sarah Buzzard was 30 years old, originally from Marion, Indiana. To her neighbors back home, she was sweet, friendly, the kind of person you'd never suspect of anything dark. After her arrest years later, one neighbor would tell reporters that if you lined up 100 women, Sarah would be the last one you'd pick as capable of violence. But people contain multitudes, don't they? Light and shadow both. Sarah had her own relationship with Naira. They were intimate, committed to each other in ways that maybe Corey and Sarah's marriage no longer reflected. And when Corey told Ryan to leave, when he made it clear Ryan was no longer welcome, something twisted inside Sarah's mind. She would later tell investigators that she blamed Ryan for ruining her marriage. That she and Corey had argued about Ryan constantly. That Ryan was the problem, the intruder, the reason everything was falling apart. It's a common thing, isn't it? Blaming someone else for the cracks that were already there. While Corey was away at the hotel, Ryan tried to plead his case to Sarah. He asked if he could stay, if there was some way to work things out. Sarah told him no. "You're here for Corey," she said. "Not for me. Corey wants you gone, so you need to leave." And then Sarah talked to Naira, told her about the conversation with Ryan. And somewhere in that discussion between the two women, a plan formed. A terrible final plan. The exact timeline of what happened next comes from Sarah's own confession, given years later when she was finally arrested. She said that when Ryan came out of the bathroom, she knocked him down. Then she put him in a chokehold, held him there while he struggled, held him while he lost consciousness. And then, crucially, she kept holding him, long after he'd gone still, long after there was any chance of bringing him back. At one point during that early morning of September 27th, someone using Sarah's Gmail account searched for the word jugular, just a single word, typed into Google. The kind of thing that would seem meaningless by itself. But in context, it's chilling. Ryan Zimmerman died in that Columbus apartment, strangled by someone who blamed him for her own unhappiness. Someone who chose murder over simply asking him to leave. But killing him was only the beginning. What happened next is the kind of horror that keeps investigators awake at night. Sarah and Naira dismembered Ryan's body in the bathtub of the apartment. They used saws to cut through bone. They separated him into pieces that could be transported, hidden, disposed of. They loaded what remained of Ryan into Sarah's 2007 Toyota Corolla. Then they drove. First, they stopped at various gas stations around Columbus, throwing parts of Ryan into public dumpsters. Imagine being the one to make those stops, pulling into a gas station at night, carrying a bag, tossing it away, driving on, again and again. Then they headed out of Columbus, driving west. They were tired by the time they reached Mercer County, Ohio. So they pulled over near West Bank State Park in that wooded area by Coldwater Creek, and they dumped most of what remained of Ryan's body. Just left him there in the woods, scattered among the trees and undergrowth. When Corey came home from his weekend at the hotel, Sarah and Naira told him that Ryan had simply left, packed his things and gone. And Corey believed them. Why wouldn't he? People leave. Plans change. Life moves on. 2 days later, on September 27th, Ryan's car was impounded by Columbus police. It had been abandoned somewhere. His father received a notice to come get it. He tried to call Ryan. No answer. Tried again. Still nothing. On November 17, 2015, Ryan's parents filed a missing persons report. Their son had vanished, and they had no idea where he'd gone or why. In January 2016, just weeks after Ryan's parents filed that missing persons report, a woman was walking her dog in West Bank State Park when her pet found the bone. The investigation began, but without a head, without dental records or fingerprints. Identifying the victim was nearly impossible. A forensic team extracted DNA from the bones and uploaded it to every database they had. The Federal Combined DNA System, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Database. Nothing matched. They checked for other skeletal remains in surrounding areas, hoping to find more of the body. Nothing. Meanwhile, life went on for Sarah and Naira. In November 2015, Sarah and Corey filed for divorce. By January 2016, the same month those bones were found, their divorce was finalized. Less than 2 weeks later, Sarah married Naira Whitaker. They moved to Marion, Indiana, got jobs, became neighbors to people who thought they were just a nice, friendly couple. The kind of neighbors who'd wave hello, chat about the weather, blend into the suburban landscape. No one suspected them of anything. Years passed. The bones in Mercer County remained unidentified. Ryan remained missing. His parents kept hoping, kept wondering, kept living with that terrible uncertainty that comes when someone you love simply disappears. The case might have stayed cold forever if not for a criminal intelligence analyst named Jennifer Lester. In 2020, she was reviewing missing persons cases from Columbus when she came across Ryan's file. She noticed something that had been overlooked. His family's DNA had never been collected. Once they got DNA samples from Ryan's parents in Kentucky and compared them to the bones found in Mercer County, everything clicked into place. After more than 4 years, Ryan Zimmerman finally had his name back. But identifying the victim was only the first step. Detectives still needed to figure out who killed him. They started digging into Ryan's life, particularly his digital life. They obtained search warrants for social media companies, tech firms, email providers. Some of these platforms were so obscure that even the sheriff admitted he'd never heard of them. The digital trail led them backward, through time. They found the conversations between Ryan and the person calling themselves Laurel Emerson. They tracked that back to Corey Buzzard. They discovered Ryan had moved to Columbus, had lived in that apartment with Corey and Sarah, and Naira. They found location data from Corey's Gmail account showing that he'd been at the Hyatt Regency downtown during the weekend. Ryan disappeared. They found Sarah's Google search for jugular. In the early hours of September 27th, they located Sarah's old Toyota Corolla. It had been sold, changed hands, but they tracked it down. The current owner cooperated fully. When forensic teams examined that car, they found traces of human blood. They searched the Columbus apartment where the four of them had lived. More traces of blood. The pieces were coming together. By July 2021, more than 5 years after Ryan's bones were discovered, investigators were ready to make arrests. On August 25, 2021, detectives coordinated simultaneous operations across 3 states. Some went to Marion, Indiana, arrest Sarah Buzzard. Others stayed in Columbus to question Nair Whitaker. They even interviewed a witness in Oak Island, North Carolina, all at the same time so no one could warn anyone else. When Sarah was taken into custody at the Marion Police Department, she confessed, told them the whole story. How she'd killed Ryan, how she blamed him for her failed marriage, how she and Naira had dismembered his body and disposed of it across Ohio. She told them about the anger, the arguments she and Corey had about Ryan, the way she felt Ryan had ruined her life, even though really the cracks in her marriage had been there all along. Meanwhile, back in Indiana, 5 deputies approached the home where Nair Whitaker was staying. When they confronted her about Ryan's death, Nair reached into her bag. She pulled out a handgun, and before anyone could stop her, she shot herself in the head. She died there at the scene. The neighbors were shocked. These were the sweet ladies who'd lived on their street for years. Friendly, normal, the kind of people who made you feel safe in your neighborhood. And now this, one arrested for murder, the other dead by her own hand. Sarah Buzzard was charged with 18 felonies, 2 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of murder, kidnapping, assault, tampering with evidence, grand theft auto, abuse of a corpse. The list went on and on. She faced the death penalty, but in December 2021, Sarah accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of aggravated murder in exchange for the other charges being dropped, and the death penalty taken off the table. The agreed sentence was life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. At her sentencing hearing on January 20th, 2022, Sarah was allowed to make a statement to the court. She called herself a flawed person, said that not a day went by that she didn't wish she could take it all back, that she accepted responsibility for Ryan's death, and would spend the rest of her life trying to redeem herself through positive actions and deeds. The prosecutor, Matthew Fox, took issue with that. He pointed out that everyone is flawed. We all make mistakes. We all have regrets. But Sarah was the only person in that courtroom who'd committed aggravated murder. Being flawed doesn't excuse taking a life. Judge Jeffrey Ingram sentenced Sarah to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She's currently serving that sentence. She'll be eligible for parole in 2051. She'll be 60 years old. Ryan Zimmerman's family finally had answers. After years of not knowing, of hoping, of imagining every possible scenario, they knew what had happened to their son. It wasn't the answer they wanted, but at least it was an answer. Some of Ryan's remains have never been found. His head, his arms and legs, cut at the joints. They're out there somewhere, maybe still in dumpsters or landfills around Columbus. Maybe scattered in places no one will ever look. Ryan's body was divided, parceled out across Ohio like he was nothing, like his life meant nothing. But his life did mean something. He was a son, a brother, a person trying to figure himself out in a complicated world. He made a choice to trust someone he met online, to believe in the possibility of connection and understanding. That choice shouldn't have cost him his life. You know, there's something uniquely modern about this case. The way it all started online. Anonymous screen names, digital conversations, people presenting themselves as one thing while being another. Ryan was looking for community, for acceptance, for people who understood what he was going through, and he found predators instead, not Corey. The investigation never implicated him in the murder. He was away when it happened. He didn't know. He believed the lie that Ryan had simply left. But Sarah and Naira, they decided that Ryan's life was disposable, that their love for each other justified murder, that fixing their problem meant eliminating a person. Sarah blamed Ryan for her divorce, but the truth is her marriage was already failing. Ryan didn't cause that. He was just there, a convenient scapegoat for all the dysfunction that already existed. And when Corey no longer wanted him around, instead of just letting him leave, Sarah made the choice to ensure he'd never leave at all. Not the apartment, not Columbus, not this life. The search for identity that led Ryan to that Craigslist ad, that brought him to Columbus, that made him vulnerable to people who saw him as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. It's heartbreaking. He was 21 years old, his whole life ahead of him. Sometimes I think about that woman walking her dog on that January morning in 2016, how that ordinary moment of enjoying nature with her pet turned into something she'll probably never forget. Finding a human bone, starting this whole investigation that would take years to resolve. I think about Ryan's parents filing that missing persons report in November 2015, hoping their son would come home, waiting for a phone call that never came, and then years later getting the worst possible news. I think about the investigators who worked this case for 5.5 years, the ones who never gave up, the analysts who noticed that small detail about the family DNA never being collected, the detectives who served search warrants on obscure tech companies, who traced digital footprints across the internet, who slowly pieced together what happened. And I think about Sarah Buzzard sitting in prison now, saying she wishes she could take it all back. Maybe she does. Maybe that's genuine remorse. But wishing doesn't bring Ryan back. Apologies don't undo strangulation. Regret doesn't reassemble a body that was cut apart and scattered. There's a lesson in here somewhere about the dangers of the internet, about the risks of meeting strangers online. But that feels too simple. Millions of people meet online every day. They form real connections, real relationships, real communities. The internet itself isn't evil. The evil was in the choices Sarah made. The choice to kill rather than simply asking someone to leave. The choice to dismember a body. The choice to lie, to hide, to move on with life as if nothing had happened. It's in those choices that we see the darkness people are capable of when they prioritize their own comfort, their own desires, their own version of events over another person's right to exist. Ryan Zimmerman wanted to explore who he was. He wanted to find acceptance. He wanted to live authentically. He should have been able to do that. He should have been safe. Instead, he ended up in pieces, scattered across Ohio, reduced to evidence in a case that took years to solve. As I finish telling you this story, I want you to remember Ryan, not as a victim, not as remains found in a park, but as a person, a young man who loved video games, who played with his little brother, who was trying to figure himself out, who made a choice to be brave, to seek connection, to move towards something new. He deserved better than what he got. He deserved to be safe, to be seen, to be valued. And Sarah Buzzard deserves to live with what she did. To spend decades behind bars thinking about the moment she put Ryan in that chokehold and didn't let go. The moment she chose murder. The moment she decided one person's life mattered less than her own convenience. That's the story. A tragedy born from the internet age, from complicated relationships, from choices that can't be undone. A reminder that behind every missing persons case is a family waiting. Behind every cold case is an investigator who refuses to give up. And behind every crime is a victim who deserves to be remembered. Ryan Zimmerman, 21 years old, gone too soon, but not forgotten. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to talk about a case that took 13 years to solve, a mystery that began in a blueberry field and ended with justice served across 2 continents. This is the story of Robert Caraballo, known for over a decade only as Jack in the Box. There's something peaceful about blueberry fields in Michigan. In the spring, they stretch out in neat rows, the bushes just beginning to wake up after winter. The soil is dark and rich, and the air carries that particular quiet you only find in rural farming country. It was in one of these fields on the 8th of May, 2002, that a farmer named Gordon DeVries made a discovery that would haunt investigators for over a decade. Gordon was checking on his property that morning, driving his truck along the dirt roads that cut between his blueberry fields near Grand Haven Township. These were lands he knew well, every tree and clearing as familiar to him as his own backyard, but as he passed a wooded area with scrub growth, something caught his eye. Something that didn't belong. At first, his brain didn't quite process what he was seeing. Sometimes our minds refuse to accept things that are too far outside the ordinary. He drove past, but the image lingered. When he circled back, his eyes confirmed what his mind had been trying to reject. There, partially hidden in the undergrowth, was a badly burned metal footlocker, and inside it, and around it, were the charred remains of a human being. The trees nearby were scorched black. The ground showed signs of intense heat. Someone had tried to erase a person from existence, had tried to turn them into nothing but ash and mystery in this quiet corner of Michigan farmland. When the Ottawa County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene, they found themselves facing a puzzle with almost no pieces. The body was so badly burned that identification seemed nearly impossible. The intense heat had destroyed most physical features. No wallet, no identification, no convenient answers. Just the remains of someone who had been violently killed and then burned in an attempt to hide the evidence. The victim was male. They could determine that much. The forensic examination revealed he had died from blunt force trauma to the head. This wasn't an accident. This was murder, brutal and deliberate. But who was he? That question would echo through the years that followed. The investigators gave him a name, because even in death, everyone deserves to be called something. They called him Jack. And because of where he was found, in that footlocker in the woods, the case became known as Jack in the Box. Detective Robert Donker took the lead on the case. He was thorough, methodical, the kind of investigator who doesn't let details slip through his fingers. He worked the case hard, following every lead, chasing down every possibility. They checked missing persons reports across multiple states. They examined dental records. They reached out to other law enforcement agencies. But every lead seemed to evaporate like morning mist. The problem with unidentified victims is that without a name, you have no starting point. You don't know where they lived, who they knew, why someone might have wanted them dead. You're trying to solve a puzzle when you don't even know what the picture is supposed to look like. Months turned into years. The case file grew thicker, but no closer to resolution. Jack remained a mystery, buried eventually in Lakeshore Cemetery in Grand Haven Township under a simple marker that bore no name. The grave was paid for by donations from police officers, their small gesture of respect for a man nobody could identify. By 2005, Detective Donker knew he needed to try something different. The traditional methods of investigation had hit a wall, so he reached out to Hope College, to a professor named David Schock, who taught documentary filmmaking. The idea was simple but unprecedented. Create a documentary about the case and release it to the public. Maybe someone somewhere would see it and recognize something. Maybe Jack's family was out there wondering what had happened to someone they loved. Professor Schock and his students threw themselves into the project. The Ottawa County Sheriff's Office gave them unprecedented access. They filmed at the crime scene, examined the evidence, interviewed the investigators. They even filmed the autopsy photos and crime scene videos, holding nothing back. The resulting 52-minute documentary was graphic, disturbing, but thorough. It was called simply Jack in the Box. The documentary was released and posted online, where it lived quietly on the internet, waiting for the right person to stumble across it, waiting for someone who knew something. Meanwhile, about 105 miles away in Charlotte, Michigan, a small town in Eaton County, life went on. A little girl named Cicely Caraballo was growing up. She was 9 years old in 2002, and that was the year her father disappeared. One day he was there, And the next day he wasn't. Her mother, Beverly McCallum, told Cicely that her father, Roberto Caraballo, had left them. He'd gone back to Canada, back to his old life. He'd abandoned them. That's what Cicely was told. And that's what she tried to believe. Even as the years passed and her father never called, never wrote, never tried to see her. Roberto, who sometimes went by Robert, was 37 years old when he disappeared. He'd had a troubled past, time spent in federal prison, a life that hadn't always gone the way he'd planned, but he had a daughter he loved, and he'd been trying to turn things around. In 2002, he'd been released from federal prison and had moved in with Beverly and her family in their home on Horatio Street in Charlotte. Beverly was his wife, though theirs was not a happy marriage. She had 2 daughters from previous relationships, Donnie and Duck Charm, who was 21 in 2002, and Cicely, who was 9. Beverly had a friend, a man named Christopher Macmillan, who was 25 at the time. He was close with Donnie Ann, and he was often around the house on Horatio Street. According to what would later come out in court, Beverly didn't want Roberto around anymore. He was, in the words of the prosecutor, cramping her lifestyle. Beverly wanted to continue living the way she'd been living, which allegedly involved drugs and activities that Roberto, trying to go straight, didn't approve of. His being around was inconvenient. He'd served his time, paid his debt to society, and was ready to be a father to Cicely, to be part of a family. But Beverly had different plans. The spring of 2002 was when everything happened. The exact date remains unclear, but it was early May, just days before Gordon DeVries would make his terrible discovery in the blueberry field. Christopher McMillan would later testify after taking a plea deal about what happened. He said the killing had been planned. He said they'd even done a test run, practicing what they would do. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden loss of control. This was premeditated murder. According to McMillan's testimony, it happened in the basement of the house on Horatio Street. The details are grim. Beverly allegedly pushed Roberto down the basement stairs first. Then, as he lay there, dazed or injured from the fall, she beat him with a hammer. The attack was so vicious that the hammer became lodged in his skull. But even that wasn't the end. While Roberto was still breathing, still clinging to life, Beverly wrapped a plastic bag around his head and suffocated him. Jeanine Ducharme, Beverly's oldest daughter, was involved too. McMillan testified that both Beverly and Jeanine participated in the killing. It was a family affair, in the darkest possible sense of that phrase. And through all of this, little Cicely was somewhere else in the house. She would later testify that she remembered being placed in her father's van that night. Though she didn't understand why at the time, the adults were going on a drive, and she was coming along. She didn't know that her father's body was in the vehicle with them, hidden in that metal footlocker. They drove across Michigan, from Charlotte to Ottawa County, to a place Beverly or one of the others knew about, a remote spot near a blueberry field. They carried the footlocker into the woods. They poured accelerant on it and set it on fire, trying to destroy the evidence, trying to make Roberto Caraballo disappear from the world as if he'd never existed. Then they drove home. They cleaned up. They changed the tires on the vehicle so they couldn't be matched any tracks. They threw away their shoes. They returned to their lives, and they told Cicely that her father had left them. The years passed slowly for Cicely. She grew up believing her father had abandoned her, that she hadn't been worth staying for. That kind of belief shapes a person, leaves marks that don't show on the surface. She turned 10, then 12, then 15. The absence of her father was a constant presence in her life. It wasn't until around 2015, when Cicely was in her early 20s, that she finally confronted her mother. She demanded the truth about what had happened to her father. Where had he really gone? Why had he never contacted her? Beverly's story had changed by then. According to Cicely's later testimony, Beverly told her a version of events that included some truth mixed with lies. She said she'd struck Roberto with a crowbar, that there'd been a fight, and then Dineen and her friends had gone into the basement and finished killing him. It was a story designed to minimize Beverly's role, to make it sound like she'd been less involved than she actually was. But at least now Cicely knew. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He'd been murdered. He'd been taken from her. And that knowledge, as painful as it was also in some ways a relief. The worst thing about being left is wondering why you weren't enough. Now Cicely knew it wasn't about her at all. But here's the remarkable thing. Around that same time, In the spring of 2015, someone else was learning the truth too. Someone had found Professor Shock's documentary online. Maybe they were browsing late at night, falling down one of those internet rabbit holes we all know. Maybe they were specifically looking for information about missing persons. However it happened, they watched Jack in the Box, and something clicked. They reached out to Detective Donker. They had information. They thought they might know who Jack was. The tip was followed up on immediately. After 13 years of silence, finally there was a break. The family members of Roberto Caraballo were contacted. Dental records were compared. DNA was analyzed. And then after all those years, after over a decade of being nobody, Jack got his name back. He was Roberto Higuie Alejandro Caraballo, and he had been 37 years old when he died. He had a daughter who had never stopped wondering about him. He had a family who had never known what happened to him. And now, finally, they had answers. Not the answers anyone wants, but answers nonetheless. Once they knew who the victim was, the investigation took on new life. Detective Donker worked with Detective James Malky from the Eaton County Sheriff's Office. They traced Roberto's last known whereabouts to Charlotte, to the house on Horatio Street. They found evidence in the basement of that house. Evidence that had been there all along, waiting to tell its story. Forensic analysis confirmed that Roberto had been murdered there, in the basement, the home he'd been living in with his wife and family. The investigators built their case carefully. They interviewed witnesses. They pieced together the timeline. And in 2019, 17 years after Roberto's death, they were ready to make arrests. Christopher McMillan was picked up in Grand Rapids. Diane Descharme was arrested in Texas where she'd been living. But Beverly McCallum was nowhere to be found. Investigators believed she'd fled to Pakistan shortly after they'd started interviewing family members. She'd sensed that the walls were closing in, that after all these years the truth was finally coming out. So she'd run. Beverly McCallum spent time in Pakistan, living under the radar, trying to stay invisible. But in February of 2020, she made a mistake. She and her teenage son checked into a hotel in Rome, Italy, just on the outskirts of the city. Italian hotels have a system where they register all guests in an online database that connects to police records. When Beverly's name was entered, the system flagged an Interpol arrest warrants. Rome police were called. Beverly McCallum was arrested. 18 years after her husband's murder, she'd been free all that time, living her life while Roberto lay in an unmarked grave, and Sicily grew up believing she'd been abandoned. But now, finally, there would be consequences. Extradition isn't always simple, especially from European countries. The Italian government had conditions. They would only extradite Beverly if the United States agreed not to try her for first-degree murder, because that carried a possible sentence of life without parole, and Italy opposes such sentences. So after lengthy negotiations, it was agreed that Beverly would be charged with second-degree murder instead. She was held in Italy for over 2 years while the legal processes worked themselves out. Finally, in July of 2022, Beverly McCallum was put on a plane and flown back to Michigan. She was taken into custody at the airport in Grand Rapids, and she was formally charged with second-degree murder and disinterment and mutilation of a body. The trials of Beverly's co-defendants had already taken place by then. Christopher McMillan had taken a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and agreed to testify against Beverly and Diane. In exchange, he received a sentence of 15 to 40 years in prison. Without his cooperation, without his testimony about what had happened in that basement, the case against the others would have been much harder to prove. Diane Descharme, Beverly's daughter, went to trial in 2021. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 21 when she helped kill her stepfather. She was in her 40s when she was finally held accountable for it. Now it was Beverly's turn. Beverly McCallum's trial took place in Charlotte, Michigan, in March of 2024, 22 years after Roberto's murder. The courtroom was packed with people wanting to see justice done, wanting to see how this decades-old story would end. The prosecution was led by Eaton County Prosecutor Doug Lloyd. He laid out the case methodically. He called Christopher McMillan to testify, and McMillan described the planning, the test run, the actual murder in chilling detail. He described how Beverly had pushed Roberto down the stairs, how she'd beaten him with the hammer, how she'd suffocated him with a plastic bag while he was still breathing. The defense tried to attack McMillan's credibility, pointing out that he was a convicted murderer himself, that he'd taken a deal to reduce his sentence. They argued that Beverly had been coerced, that she'd been afraid, that she'd been forced to help dispose of the body but hadn't participated in the actual killing. But then the prosecution played their trump card. They called Cicely Caraballo to testify. Cicely was now in her 30s. She'd spent most of her life not knowing what had happened to her father, then spent years knowing he'd been murdered, but seeing no justice. Now she sat in a courtroom and looked at her mother, the woman who had killed her father and then lied to her for over a decade. Cicely's testimony was devastating to the defense. She described the conversations she'd had with her mother, including the time Beverly had admitted to striking Roberto with a crowbar. She contradicted her mother's claims that the injuries Beverly had inflicted were minor. She refuted Beverly's assertion that she didn't know what certain tools were. Cicely's testimony made it clear that Beverly had been far more involved than she was now claiming. The jury foreman would later say that Cicely's testimony had tipped the scales for them. Here was a young woman who had every reason to want to believe her mother was innocent, but who instead told the truth, even though that truth destroyed any hope of a relationship with the only parent she had left. Beverly McCallum took the stand in her own defense, which is always a risky move. She tried to paint herself as a victim, as someone who had been coerced or forced, but as prosecutor Lloyd pointed out, her story didn't make sense. She claimed she'd been afraid for her daughter's lives, afraid that Christopher and Dinah would hurt them if she didn't cooperate. But if that were true, why hadn't she driven away once the body was disposed of? Why had she stayed with these supposedly dangerous people? The prosecutor argued that the real reason Beverly wanted Roberto dead was simple. He was cramping her lifestyle. He was trying to go straight, trying to be a good father, and that didn't fit with the life Beverly wanted to live. So she'd recruited her daughter and her daughter's friend, and together they'd planned and executed a murder. The jury deliberated for just under 2 hours. On April 1st, 2024, they returned with their verdict. Guilty on both counts. Beverly McCallum was convicted of second-degree murder and disinterment and mutilation of a body. Beverly showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. She sat there still and silent as the words washed over her. Guilty. After 22 years, guilty. Sentencing was scheduled for May 23rd, 2024. When that day came, the courtroom was once again full. Beverly arrived in a wheelchair. Whether due to genuine health issues or an attempt to garner sympathy, no one could say for certain. Cicely Caraballo gave a victim impact statement. She stood before the court and spoke about her father, about the man who had been ripped from her life when she was just 9 years old. She spoke about growing up thinking she'd been abandoned, about the damage that belief had caused, and she spoke directly to her mother, telling her that despite Beverly's ill will and disgraceful parenting, Cicely had become a good person, a strong person, someone Beverly couldn't take credit for. Cicely also requested that any restitution from the case be used to help other children of murdered parents, turning her pain into something that might help others. Judge Janice Cunningham didn't mince words when she delivered the sentence. She called Beverly McCallum a threat to anyone who got in her way. She pointed out a moment during the trial when Beverly had leaned into the courtroom monitors to get a closer look at her dead husband's autopsy photos. A moment that had disturbed everyone who witnessed it. What kind of person looks at photos of someone they killed with such apparent detachment? The sentence was 40 to 60 years in prison. Beverly McCallum was 63 years old at the time. Even with the possibility of parole after 40 years, she would be over 100 years old before she could walk free. Effectively, it was a life sentence. And so the story ends, though not with the kind of closure that truly heals. Roberto Caraballo is still gone. Cicely still grew up without her father. Those years can't be given back, but there is something to be said for justice, for the truth finally coming out, for the people responsible being held accountable. The case had required the dedication of multiple detectives over more than 2 decades. Detective Donker and Detective Maltby had both retired before seeing the case through to its conclusion, but their work laid the foundation. Sergeant Josh Ivy saw it through to the end, making sure that every piece of evidence was in place, that the case was as strong as it could possibly be. Professor David Schock's documentary, that unconventional decision to put the case out into the world, had made all the difference. Without it, the tip that identified Roberto might never have come in. Without it, Jack might have remained nameless forever. It's a reminder that sometimes solving a case requires thinking outside traditional methods, requires taking a chance on something that's never been done before. And Roberto Caraballo, who spent 13 years known only as Jack in the Box, now rests in Lakeshore Cemetery under his own name. His family knows where he is. His daughter knows what happened to him. The uncertainty is gone, replaced by grief. Yes, but also by knowledge. And knowledge, even painful knowledge, is better than the endless wondering. Beverly McCallum is in prison, where she will remain for the rest of her life. Denying the term is serving life without parole. Christopher McMillan has at least 15 years left on his sentence. The people responsible for Roberto's death have all been held accountable, even if it took 22 years. Thusly Caraballo continues her life, carrying the weight of what happened, but not letting it destroy her. She faced her mother in court and spoke her truth. She honored her father's memory by refusing to let him be forgotten. That takes a kind of courage that's hard to quantify. The house on Horatio Street in Charlotte still stands, though other families live there now unaware of what happened in the basement all those years ago. The blueberry field where Roberto's body was found continues to produce its crop every summer. Life goes on as it always does, flowing around tragedy like water around a stone. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, you can imagine Detective Donker in the early years of the case, sitting with that file, looking at the evidence of Jack in the Box, promising himself that someday he'd find out who this person was. You can imagine Professor Shock and his students editing their documentary, hoping against hope that someone would see it and come forward. You can imagine Cicely as a little girl, wondering why her father never called, never visited, never showed up for her birthday. And you can take comfort in the fact that eventually the truth came out. It took 13 years just to put a name to the victim. It took another 9 years to bring all the responsible parties to justice. But it happened. The system worked, slowly and imperfectly, but it worked. Roberto Caraballo mattered. His life mattered, his death mattered, and the search for justice on his behalf mattered. In a world that can feel random and chaotic, there's something profound about that. The people who worked this case, over decades through retirements and career changes, they never forgot Jack. They never stopped trying. And eventually they succeeded. That's the story of the murder of Robert Caraballo. A story of betrayal and violence, yes, but also a story of persistence and dedication. A story that reminds us that some people spend their lives fighting for justice for people they never knew, simply because it's the right thing to do. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.